Buenas tardes desde el Hotel La Florida. Bienvenidos a el inicio del ciclo de conferencias Barcelona Inspira Consciencia. En un entorno maravilloso. La ciudad de Barcelona es muy conocida por su creatividad, por todo lo que tiene que ver con la innovación social, y es un marco idóneo para arrancar este ciclo de conferencias. Es un ciclo de conferencias que vamos a empezar hoy y que cada semana, durante un plazo de 7 semanas, cada miércoles a las 7:30 de la tarde tendremos diferentes líderes y es un ciclo de conferencias al cual se puede acceder online de forma gratuita. Incluso si se está accediendo de manera online, se pueden estar haciendo preguntas que serán después respondidas por los ponentes. El ciclo de Barcelona Inspira Consciencia tiene un objetivo principal. Estamos en un momento de crisis, estamos en un momento de cambio, estamos en un momento en el que las personas se tienen que enfrentar a nuevas situaciones. Estamos en uno de esos momentos en los cuales dicen las personas sabias que lo nuevo todavía no ha llegado, que lo antiguo todavía no se ha ido, y es en esos momentos en los que lo que todavía no se ha ido está generando ruido y nos está generando sufrimiento, en el que los paradigmas que conocíamos, en el que las situaciones que nosotros estábamos acostumbrados a enfrentar parece que se tambalean, parece que todo lo que hay a nuestro alrededor parece que tiembla y no sabemos muy bien cómo enfrentarnos. Parece que muchas personas tenemos muchísima ilusión porque todo lo nuevo que está llegando realmente se acelere y realmente nos ofrezca nuevas oportunidades y que nos gustaría participar de ello. Pero parece que las personas, cuando nos enfrentamos con estas situaciones en las cuales lo que conocíamos ya no es tan válido como pensábamos y crece la inseguridad, en la que perdemos nuestros trabajos, en las que vemos que la gente que queremos pasa momentos de sufrimiento, aquellos ejemplos, aquellos trucos, aquellas formas de funcionar que para nosotros eran las adecuadas y que siempre han funcionado, parece que ya no podemos recurrir a ellas. Es un buen momento para empezar a decidir cómo podemos enfrentarnos a todos estos momentos de cambio, y Barcelona Inspira Consciencia, con el ciclo de 7 conferencias Reinvéntate, lo que pretende de alguna manera es ofrecer diferentes pistas, es emprender un viaje excitante, un viaje apasionante de la mano de 7 líderes sociales muy reconocidos de diferentes ámbitos, que van a ofrecer diferentes puntos de vista y diferentes, no recetas, pero seguramente diferentes brújulas para poder transitar este viaje. Al final, las personas somos dueñas de nuestra vida, somos dueñas de nuestro camino, somos dueñas de nuestros pasos, y eso significa que tenemos que escuchar, que tenemos que apreciar lo que nos dicen, tenemos que decidir si eso es válido para nosotros o no es válido para nosotros, pero al final estamos solos delante de nuestras decisiones. Y estar solo delante de nuestras decisiones significa que tenemos que valorar lo que otras personas nos ofrecen y luego tenemos que decidir cómo deseamos vivir nuestra vida. Y ese es precisamente el punto central de vivir. El punto central de vivir es que somos libres para vivir nuestra vida como queremos vivirla. Vamos a tener 7 líderes de opinión que nos van a ofrecer sus recetas, sus experiencias, sus aprendizajes, sus diferentes puntos de vista, y al final las personas tenemos que ser capaces de crear una forma positiva de vivir nuestra vida, una forma en la que nosotros llevemos las riendas de nuestra vida, que la construyamos de aquella manera que de verdad queremos construirla. Por eso es un privilegio comenzar este ciclo de conferencias con una persona que representa a nivel mundial de la forma más poderosa y de la forma más prestigiosa que puede haber, precisamente ese tomar las riendas de nuestra vida, hasta el punto de ser capaz de crear realidad, de con nuestros pensamientos, con nuestros deseos, con nuestras creencias, ser capaz de crear realidad, ser capaz de modificarnos. Y es un punto muy interesante el entender que la historia de la humanidad ha tenido una dualidad entre la ciencia y la espiritualidad. Esa dualidad a veces nos ha hecho avanzar, pero a veces también nos ha frenado. A veces hemos querido creer sin más y hemos querido confiar en que lo que creíamos ocurriría, pero a veces hemos tenido temores, a veces hemos buscado en la ciencia explicaciones, hemos buscado no creer sino entender. Y es en esa dualidad entre el creer y el entender en la que nos hemos estado moviendo mucho tiempo. Esa dualidad no siempre ha estado bien casada y nos ha generado pues muchas veces incluso zozobra y nos ha generado ruido interior y ruido exterior. Pero al final las personas somos tres dimensiones. Somos una dimensión de cuerpo, una dimensión física, somos una dimensión mental muy poderosa que nos dirige y somos también una dimensión espiritual. Y no podemos estar rotos, no podemos estar separando esas tres dimensiones, porque no somos una u otra. Cuando somos principalmente la dimensión cuerpo, estamos desequilibrados. Cuando somos principalmente cualquiera de las otras dimensiones, también estamos equilibrados. Cuando somos verdaderamente nosotros y verdaderamente unos, cuando estas tres dimensiones viven en armonía y nos permiten ser nosotros mismos y estar sólidamente asentados en nosotros. Y ahí es donde entra pues, nuestro invitado de esta tarde, Joe Dispenza, el doctor Joe Dispenza. Nos hace un regalo magnífico, nos hace un regalo que es ayudarnos a conciliar esas tres dimensiones no siempre tan bien conciliadas. El entender y el creer, el ser capaces de generar ese puente en el cual lo que de verdad creemos dentro de nosotros, que es lo que somos, lo que podemos ser, que de verdad podemos influir en nuestra realidad, que de verdad podemos crear nuestra realidad, que de verdad somos soberanos de nosotros mismos y que mandamos en nosotros mismos, que esa creencia no sea solamente una creencia, sino que también la dimensión mente pueda entenderlo. Y ese regalo de hacernos más fácil vivir es un regalo que el doctor Joe Dispenza nos hace pues, con sus super bestsellers prestigiosos a nivel mundial, con sus enseñanzas, con sus conferencias, con sus ratos estupendos como el que vamos a pasar esta tarde aquí. Nos construye ese puente en el cual nos explica de una forma tremendamente sencilla que podemos entender y podemos creer y que al final es lo mismo. No me voy a extender acerca de lo que él nos va a explicar porque lo va a hacer él tremendamente mejor que yo y ese es el último punto que quiero destacar. Otras personas han intentado explicar desde un punto de vista científico la espiritualidad y lo que somos. Pero a veces eso se ha hecho con lenguajes crípticos y el lenguaje críptico el problema que tiene es que no llega al común de la gente y al final la humanidad genera la realidad toda junta. Necesitamos que seamos todos los que seamos capaces de generar esa realidad que todos deseamos y que crezca. El doctor Joe Dispenza lo explica de una manera tan sencilla, algo que es tan complejo como la neurociencia, como los procesos cerebrales, los procesos químicos, como cómo nuestras células cerebrales se conectan entre ellas. Lo explica de una manera tan sencilla que las personas sin ninguna formación son capaces de entenderlo, son capaces de asimilarlo, son capaces de conectarlo con sus creencias y son capaces de sentir, somos capaces de sentir que es verdad que tenemos el poder dentro de crear nuestra realidad, de incidir en nuestra realidad, de ser de verdad libres, de ser capaces de decidir cómo queremos que sea nuestra vida, cómo queremos que sea el transitar por este camino y cómo queremos que sea la realidad que nos rodea. Es por esta razón y seguramente por muchas más por las cuales el doctor Dispenza es una figura no solamente a nivel mundial, sino que especialmente en España tiene legiones de seguidores. Las librerías le aman porque no solamente venden muchísimos libros suyos, sino que se ahorran muchísimo en decoración, porque no sé si él lo sabe, pero desde hace muchos meses los escaparates de las librerías, el libro que tienen como bestseller es este y no han tenido que invertir más en decoración, en cambiarla. No quiero extenderme más, quiero presentar al doctor Joe Dispenza. Cuando acabemos de esta conversación, los que están al otro lado de la cámara podrán dirigir preguntas por el chat y yo haré las preguntas al doctor y él las contestará. Gracias por estar aquí, doctor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that Darwin had it really well when he said it's not the strongest of species that survives or the most intelligent of species, but the one that's the most adaptable to change. And if you look around the world right now, whether you're looking at the economic model or the political model, or even certain aspects of the religious model, the environment, the medical model. There's several different parts of our culture that's beginning to collapse. And if you study human nature historically, we always wait for crisis or trauma or disease or diagnosis, both as an individual and as a culture, before we decide to change. And if you look at this and you study it in history, it's a sign that something new has to be born. So as the old model of reality begins to change, something else has to replace it. So we have two ways that we actually face crisis. We can either face crisis in a state of emergency, which in the beginning of a crisis is healthy, or we can face crisis in a state of creativity and innovation. So let's talk about that biologically, because it says a lot about how a culture responds, or a person individually. When you and I react to conditions in our life, stressful conditions, we turn on a very primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system, or what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And when we react to our external environment and we see a chaos or a threat or a trauma, our primitive nervous system tells us that we either have two options. We either run or we fight. And we mobilize enormous amounts of energy because, from a historical standpoint, running and fighting from a predator was the best way for our chances of survival. So our stressors have become a little bit more complex. We have finances, we have jobs, we have traffic jams, we have internet connections, we have second mortgages, we have single parenting. And all of these elements turn on that primitive nervous system as if we're being chased by a lion. So in the short term, all organisms in nature can deal with short-term stress. A zebra gets chased by a lion, 15 minutes later it goes back to grazing and the stress is over. It returns back to homeostasis. Now, stress is when your body and brain are knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. So we know from a scientific standpoint that when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for disease. Now you're headed for some type of breakdown. So if you look at a crisis in terms of emergency, and we're releasing all these primitive chemicals of adrenaline and cortisol, those chemicals create the emotional states of anger, of frustration, of aggression, of hatred, of fear, of anxiety, of insecurity, of hopelessness, of powerlessness, of guilt, of shame, of depression. Those chemicals of stress bring us to a lower denominator. And what we know from those chemicals is that most people will do the same exact thing and react in predictable ways, but expect something to change in their life. In other words, those chemicals endorse the ego, and we become very selfish. We become self-indulgent, self-centered, self-involved, self-important, self-serving, full of self-pity. It's all about the self. Now, this is the tragedy, because in crisis, if you're addressing a financial crisis or a crisis in a culture and everybody is selfish and everybody's living by those emotions, then they're pushing their way to get to the head of the line. They're competing. They're forcing outcomes. They're using very primitive systems to try to take care of themselves. And we know from the physiology of the brain that most of the blood supply goes to the hindbrain and away from the forebrain. And those chemicals create a gap between the way things appear in our life and the way things really are. In other words, we're viewing reality in an altered state. So we don't see possibility. We feel separate from each other. We are competing and striving to get to the head of the line by using our cunning, manipulative, egocentric ways to get there, and we're very controllable. Fear is very controllable. Competition is very controllable. Anger and war divides individuals. Now, that is not a way to address a crisis, because the service to self, or taking care of the self, is the exact thing that enhances the crisis. Because if you and I are all doing the same, if we're all doing the same thing, then a culture becomes more divided. It becomes more disintegrated. It becomes more incoherent. And possibility then is not part of the equation. So, the other state of mind, if you can view crisis as a great opportunity brilliantly disguised as an impossible situation, and you have to match the conditions in your environment with a new mind. Now we're talking about greatness, because innovation and creativity and a new way of thinking and a new way of being means that we can't do the same thing from the past. And so in history, cultures that, or individuals that overcame their environmental conditions were considered mystics and saints and leaders and charismatic leaders. They were individuals that saw past the illusion of the present reality. Now, when we begin to become innovative or creative, the brain begins to switch. We begin to turn on the forebrain, the frontal lobe, which is really the crowning achievement of the human being, and we begin to ask bigger questions. How can we create a new way of being in a world that's falling apart? How can we begin to create a new system to adapt to these conditions? Now, the hardest part, without a doubt, in all of my research about change is not making the same choice as you did the day before. So reason this. You think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day. Out of those 60 to 70,000 thoughts that you think, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. So the same thoughts will lead to the same choices. The same choices will lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors will create the same experiences. The same experiences create the same emotions, and those same emotions drive the same thoughts, and that's called a personality. And your biology is a reflection of your state of being. So then your personality is directly related to your personal reality. And your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So in order for you to create a new personal reality, a new life, then you have to begin to examine the thoughts that you're thinking and decide if you want to continue thinking that way or choose a new way of thinking. You have to become aware and observe your behaviors and look to see if those habits are something that's going to support a new future. And you have to look at the emotions that you've memorized that keep you connected to the past and decide if those emotions are healthy. So most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. We literally have to become somebody else. So it stands to reason then, as you begin to question and speculate possibilities, the Wright brothers, Madame Curie, Thomas Edison, Benjamin Franklin, Marconi, they were all thinking outside the box. They were asking questions. Is there a way to create this outcome? And when they began to think in new and unusual ways, new thoughts lead to new choices. New choices lead to new behaviors lead to new experiences create new emotions, and all of a sudden you start to transform. So, in order to change a culture, you have to change individuals. We have to change it individual by individual. Now, this requires then, by not making the same choices you did the day before, to begin to think and act in different ways. This is the creative function of human beings. So if an economy is collapsing, if a government is deceiving, if people are no longer feeling supported, then we have to think in uncommon ways in order to adapt to the environment. If we don't, then it is really the environment, the external world, that's controlling how we think and feel. We're victims to the external world. is it possible to change the way you think and feel and have some effect in your environment? Now, that is a concept that when people are struggling to survive becomes very difficult, because you're still worried about the food on your table, you're still worried about the well-being of your children, but what's the alternative? I mean, there aren't many other alternatives. So then when we start asking unlimited questions like, what would be a great way to run a business in this changing world? How could I begin to influence my future? It requires one amazing thing, and that is gaining knowledge, gaining information. Every time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your brain. That's what learning is. And as you begin to think about new ways of being and you're learning new information, the brain begins to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And whenever you make the brain work differently, you are changing your mind. Mind is the brain in action. So when we begin to get creative, something unusual happens. We stop living by those survival emotions. Those survival emotions alter our perception and cause us to look at the future through the lens of the past. As we begin to design a new way of being, we have to lay down the very thing that we used our whole life to get what we want for something greater to take over. Now we're talking about genius. Now we're talking about innovation. Now once the idea comes, the next step is that you have to take action. You have to do something with it. So for example, a person may say, I lost my job, and they may see it as the worst thing that ever happened to them. But Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. He was on the board and they fired him. And then he created Pixar. And then when he created Pixar, they hired him back onto Apple and Macintosh, and he became the leading executive. So when we have situations in our life, most people are defined by those situations emotionally. They brands them, and they no longer want to move forward. So let's say a person loses their job, and they're confronting difficult conditions. But a person who would say, well, let me look at the world. China is doing very well. I have a little experience in computers. Hey, I have experience in sales. Oh, I know a person who travels back and forth to China. And we start having to think outside the box. So maybe I can begin to leave the present reality that I have and begin to explore new realities. Now, it means that you have to be willing to step into the unknown. It means that you have to step outside the familiar self. So there's this kind of model that says, here's the old self, and here's the new self. And there's a gap between the two. And when we no longer think, act, and feel in the same way, all of a sudden we start to feel uncomfortable. We start to feel unfamiliar. It starts to become unknown to us. And most people, the moment they step outside of the old self, because they're no longer making the same choice, they don't feel like themselves any longer. So the first thing they do is they make the same choices that produce the same behaviors, that create the same experiences, that produce the same emotions, and they say, this feels comfortable. Well, it feels familiar. The person, the maverick, who's willing to step out into the unknown, that unknown is the perfect place to create from. Because only in the unknown can you create something new. And if you and I can become comfortable in that unknown place, then the best way to predict the future is to create it from that unknown place. Now, when people start crossing the river of change from the old self to the new self, because they're no longer thinking, acting, and feeling in the same way, there is literally a biological, a neurological, a genetic, a chemical death of the old self. And this dark night of the soul, this unfamiliar place, is the true value, the true step towards developing a new self. So then if we're leaving the old and we are creating the new, then the next most important question is, Well, if I'm going to create a new self, what thoughts do I want to think? What behaviors can I plan? And as you begin to image and rehearse a new way of being, you're changing your brain and body neurologically and biologically. That's the neuroscientific model of mental rehearsal. And as we begin to remind ourselves who we no longer want to be, and we remind ourselves every day of who we do want to be, there'll come a moment where we begin to silence the circuits in our brain that are connected to the old self and inhibit the chemicals that reaffirm the same identity, and then begin to fire and wire new circuits in our brain that begins to install the neurological hardware that begins to create a level of inspiration where we start seeing new possibilities. We see a new landscape. We see a new horizon. And that person who crosses the river of change then all of a sudden has new opportunities in their life. And they're seeing possibilities that they never saw before. And the doors begin to open in their life. They begin to notice, wow, I'm so glad I got fired from that old job, because I would have never thought of living in China or traveling back and forth to Beijing and selling this product there. I never would have thought of opening a market in South Africa, whatever it is for the person. But they weren't thinking about it as their old self. They only can see it as their new self. So it's a time in history where crisis can be viewed as emergency, or crisis can be viewed as opportunity and innovation. And I think that people, when they begin to feel empowered by possibility, when they begin to see that the death of the old paradigms means the beginning of a new paradigm. Now here's the caveat. It's important because we know from the research that meditation lowers crime rate in communities. That's a fact. But when the meditators leave the community, the crime rate returns back to the same level. So it's not enough to just think peace or to think abundance. You have to demonstrate it. You have to demonstrate it in every single area of your life. In other words, if you don't like the war, you better not be warring with your coworker or arguing with your spouse. In order for you to stand up for peace, you have to be peaceful. If you don't like a government that's taking from you, start giving. Because as you begin to demonstrate that in your life, you give people permission to do the same. And as you and I begin to demonstrate peace in all areas of our life and everybody else does the same, something amazing happens. We move from this selfish model, driven by the hormones of stress, to this selfless model. And a selfless model means your heart is open and you are considering the whole when you make a decision, and that you and I are connected in some way. And I am trusting in the future instead of contracting from it, that I am connected to something greater, that I feel possibility in my life. And so we go from this selfish model driven by the hormones of stress that endorse the ego to the selfless model of everybody beginning to become connected. And so now if you're taking care of you, and you are taking care of, you're eliminating your anger or your frustration, because those hormones are very addictive. And I'm taking care of my fear and my anxiety, and someone else is taking care of their judgment and their criticism, and they're overcoming themselves. By each individual transforming themselves, the culture begins to transform very naturally. But if you're going to hold on to anger, if you're going to hold on to fear, if you're going to hold on to pain and sadness, then you'll never see possibility, and you'll only be interested in the immediate gratification that takes away that pain. Culture will never survive that way. So I think it's a very, very exciting time to be alive right now. I think a new model has to be put into place, and the model is based on selflessness. The model is based on the concept that if we want to see peace in the world, we have to demonstrate it. If we want to see abundance in the world, we have to be abundant. Gold only attracts gold. Lead doesn't attract gold. And if everybody was doing that individually and taking care of themselves, and they got that message in their head, you would see a culture all of a sudden begin to unify and to begin to connect. And that kind of idealism begins to create this concept called oneness. And oneness means that I'm connected to something greater, you're connected to something greater. What I do to you, I'm doing to myself. And so let's, as a species, as a group of individuals, begin to give, begin to take care of ourselves. And in closing, the research that I've done that has been so inspiring is that there's so much talk about self-love in the world, you know, self-love, love yourself. Well, true self-love happens when you overcome yourself, when you break free from the chains of those emotional addictions that keep you at a lower denominator, when people transmute anger into compassion, when they change fear into courage, when they take sadness and they turn it into freedom. It's the same energy, that they just liberate themselves from the past. And when people do that, the side effect of it is an appreciation for all of life, an appreciation for the moment, a relaxation, a sense of spontaneity and poise and joy that I call the natural state of being. That natural state of being is our birthright. That's who we really are. Psychology says, well, anger and aggression and fear and anxiety, insecurity, pain, those are normal states of consciousness. No, those are altered states of consciousness. The true states of consciousness is living in this state of freedom, in the state of inspiration, in the state of joy. And so in my research, I've seen that when people actually take care of themselves and they begin to, instead of look outside of themselves for answer, no longer rely on governments or companies or corporations to make them feel better, but they're doing it on themselves, with themselves. When they transmute and change beyond their own self-limitations, they begin to love themselves, and they begin to love all of life, and all of a sudden now, they're no longer acting in predictable ways. And if they're no longer knee-jerking to the conditions in their life, boy, that all of a sudden sets off a chain reaction in the world where people begin to observe that. That person's different. Well, if you get enough individuals understanding the concept of change and everybody implementing it in their own way, it will be that concept of the 100th monkey. That'll be the concept of true transformation that happens quite naturally and quite easily. So crisis can be seen as emergency, or crisis can be seen as opportunity for true transformation, innovation, creativity, new ideas. And we have to think outside the box in order to do that. And thinking outside the box means we have to leave our present understanding of reality, learn new information, begin to contemplate that information, and begin to take steps towards our destiny. The hardest part of all of this is making the time to learn, making the time to prepare ourselves, making the time to design a new future, and then having the willingness to step into it and say, I trust in the unknown, instead of being afraid of the unknown.
I don't know how much do you know our country, but it's the brightest picture of what is happening in this country now, I have heard. It's exactly what is happening.
And I think it's happening in a lot of cultures around the world. I think Spain is in southern European countries are experiencing the hardest hit from it. But this is not the first time in history this has happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, globalization is taking place, and it means then that people have to become. There are solutions to every problem that we've created as a culture, as a species. But the solutions to those problems cannot be addressed from the same level of mind that created them. So that means anger and frustration and hatred and judgment. You can't solve the problems in those states. You have to get beyond those emotional states to be able to see the solutions to those problems. And if you're going to hold on to them, then you will analyze the problem within the emotion that you're addicted to, and it will reaffirm your own emotional state, and that is the karma, or the loop that people live in every day. So, what's the definition of an addiction? Something you can't stop, something you can't live without. People say, well, I'm not addicted to judgment, or I'm not addicted to anger. Well, then let's see you not suffer. Let's see you not be judgmental for a whole day. and fast from those emotional states and give your body a chance to heal. Now, we're talking about a new science, but we know from our research that people who actually do it have a fundamental shift, not only in their life, but in their health.
I think we have some questions from audience.
Okay.
Do we go with it?
Yes, let's do it.
Well, we have the first one. I make it first in Spanish and then I translate it in English. Muy bien, la primera pregunta de la audiencia es, muy buena pregunta, ¿cuál es la mejor manera de amarse a uno mismo? Which is the best way to love ourselves?
Well, I think most people in Western cultures confuse pleasure with self-love. And they think that getting a manicure or pedicure or buying themselves a sports car is self-love. Now that's pleasure. And people, when they seek pleasure in order to avoid pain, now we're bridging on the concept of addiction, because when they get something pleasurable in their life, there's a release of certain chemicals in the brain, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and those chemicals produce a burst of good feeling. And when the person notices a change in their internal state, they feel differently, the pain goes away, the emptiness goes away, they look to see what caused it. Oh, it was that pill, oh, it was that shopping, it was the buying the car, it's the pedicure, and they begin to develop a dependency where they think that change or regulating their emotional states should be done by relying on things outside of them. Now, transformation, really true transformation, is when people begin to look at the emotions that they've memorized that has become part of their identity. And when they look at the emotions that they've been living by and how those emotions drive their thoughts, how those feelings influence their behaviors, and what other emotions are created from those emotions. Now we're talking about somebody becoming conscious, becoming aware. The first step for true transformation is becoming aware or conscious of your unconscious thoughts, your unconscious behaviors, your memorized emotions. And the fact that we can think about how we think, the fact that we can observe how we're acting, the fact that we can pay attention to how we're feeling means we can modify ourselves to do a better job in life. That's called metacognition. So when a person begins to wake up to who they're being, and then they say, like Gandalf on the bridge in Lord of the Rings, "You may not pass today." That kind of decision becomes an experience for the person that they never forget. That kind of willingness to change is when they transmute those survival emotions into elevated emotions. And those emotions, because they're addictive and emotions are the record of the past, then for the most part, the body as the unconscious mind does not know the difference between an experience in your life that creates an emotion and an emotion that you can fabricate by thought alone. To the body, it's the same. So a person who's living in anger every day or sadness in every day, their body as their unconscious mind is believing it's in the same past conditions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The body's in the past. So when a person takes that emotion and literally denatures it and turns it into another emotion, the freedom from that addiction, breaking the chains from that emotional addiction, is called self-love, is called joy. Now there's a liberation of energy. And the person is in love with themselves, they're in love with their life, and they say, that was so worth it. And all of a sudden, they look back at their past, and they say, I would never change anything in my past because it brought me to this present moment. And when you can look back at your past that way, then the past rolls up to the present moment, and now you're beginning to experience true freedom.
Esta pregunta la había hecho Mario, me he dejado el nombre, y tenemos una nueva pregunta por parte de Inma. Igma es una persona que está preocupada por los demás, como deberíamos estarlo todos, y su pregunta es, ¿cómo podemos ayudar a una persona que sigue con sus patrones y que le cuesta cambiar? The question is from Igma. She's really trying to help others, and she's asking, how can we help a person that keeps his patterns and keeps doing the things in a way that makes hard to change? How can we help that person?
Well, I always say that the best way to have anybody change is to demonstrate it in your life. That certain people will not see possibility until they reach crisis, till they reach their lowest level, and then they're going to wake up and say, I better change. I think the greatest demonstration of change really is to begin to show others how to do it, to be the living example of it. That when you and I are the living example of joy, that when we are not attached to what people think or emotions that keep us feeling sick, and we are celebrating life, and we are passionate about our future, that we are filled with ideas and inspiration. That's a very contagious state of being. And people that are lost in habits or lost in those emotional states, they will see it initially as a affront. It'll be a confronting moment for them. But inside them, they secretly want to be free. They just don't know how to do it. So we always say in our workshops, you always know when someone's in the midst of change because they stop talking about it. They don't talk about it. They're too busy being it. So if you and I are waking up every morning and demonstrating change in our life, the people in our life have one of two choices. They either begin to become inspired by change for themselves, not because you're preaching to them philosophically, but because you're demonstrating it in your life. They'll either rise up to that, or the person cannot maintain a relationship with the person who's living in such freedom, which means they'll probably stay the same for the rest of their life. But if crisis happens, they may make another choice. So my recommendation for people who are steeped in habits and emotional states and patterns of thought, the individuals around them have to live in a state of joy. They have to live in a state of freedom. They have to demonstrate it in every single area of their life. And normally, there's a thing in physics called entrainment, which means sooner or later, others start to vibrate at the same rate as you. So be the example, and don't drop to their level of suffering, because if a person is suffering or a person is stuck in a pattern, they're using people and conditions in their life to reaffirm that addiction to suffering, to that addiction to guilt, that addiction to difficulty. But if they're no longer using you for that addiction because you're overjoyed, they have a choice now. They can surrender that, and that's the greatest thing you can do for them, is to no longer meet them on that level, but begin to influence them to rise up, not by what you say, but who you are.
Tenemos una pregunta por parte de Isabel, muy conectada con la realidad nuestra en este momento. Isabel pregunta, ¿cuál es el punto desde el cual, a partir del cual, supera uno la frustración de haberlo perdido casi todo? Which is the point of beginning to overcome the frustration of losing everything in your life?
Well, you have one of two choices. Now listen, nothing wrong with feeling frustrated. Nothing wrong with feeling sad. Emotions are not bad. They're the end product of past experiences. And we can remember experiences better because we can remember how we feel. But when you have a reaction to someone or something in your life, there's a refractory period of chemicals that are created. There is an alteration in your chemistry. And if you don't know how to control that refractory period, and you allow it to linger for hours or days, that's called a mood. A mood is one long emotional reaction. If you keep that refractory period going for weeks or months, that's called a temperament. So I say, why are you so frustrated? Well, I lost everything 6 months ago, and I'm living by the same emotional reaction. If you keep that emotional reaction going for years on end, that's called a personality trait. So most people's personalities are defined by the emotions that they memorized. And so you would say, why are you so frustrated? Well, I'm frustrated because I lost everything 9 months ago, or 2 years ago, or 5 years ago. Now, purely from an objective standpoint, what that means is I was altered in some way because I lost everything, and I haven't been able to change for the last 2 years. As a matter of fact, my frustration keeps me connected to my past. Now, shortening the refractory period of your emotional reaction is emotional intelligence. A great thing to teach children. But if a person's going to live in frustration and that is their identity, and then they're going to tell the story of how they lost everything within that emotion, then they're firing and wiring the same circuits in their brain and emotionally conditioning their body to more frustration. And their identity now is connected to the past. Now, they will never create a new future holding on to those emotions of the past. Now, I have had many challenges in my life that have left very strong emotions. I understand them, I'm human. But at what point do you realize that living by frustration is, number one, not loving to you? Because those chemicals push the genetic buttons that will ultimately create a disease, number one. And number two, frustration is causing you to view your life through the lens of frustration, so you're going to look for more things in your life to reaffirm your addiction to frustration. And then you're going to hang out with people that complain and are frustrated too, and you're going to use each other to reaffirm your addiction, and that's called a culture. So then there comes a moment where a person finally says enough, and they say, no more. And they begin to look at how they think. They begin to pay attention to how they're feeling. They begin to become conscious of how they're behaving when they're in that state. And if you're observing those states of mind and body, it means you're no longer the automatic program. You're the consciousness now observing the program, and that's when you begin to objectify your subjective self. You're the observer of the self, which means you're no longer the addiction or the biology, the program that you're rooted in. Every great person in history knew this. We go to movies to watch people overcome insurmountable odds because we secretly believe in our own greatness. So whether I'm talking to a CEO of a company or to a prison inmate or the janitor that's sweeping the floor in a school, everybody secretly believes in their own greatness. And when you realize that that frustration is keeping you anchored to the past, and you realize that there's a whole lot of future for you to create, when you can really reason that in your mind, you'll say, what is this frustration worth to me? And when you begin to break free of it, you will be liberated and new opportunities will come into your life. So again, study the knowledge that shows you that there are future possibilities. Nelson Mandela, he had a whole lot of reasons to hate. He had a whole lot of reasons to be frustrated. Had a whole lot of reasons to be judgmental. 27 years in prison, sooner or later he realized, I got to be creative. You know, first 10 years of his life, he said, I'm never going to get out of here. I'm never going to get out of here. I'm never going to get out of here. And he was creating the emotions of hatred and anger. He's looking outside his prison after 10 years. And he said his heart spoke to him. And all of a sudden, it said, maybe you could get out of here. What if you could get out of here? And he started thinking, how could I get out of here? How could I get out of here? Ask the frontal lobe question. And all of a sudden, the frontal lobe begins to select different networks of neurons and seamlessly piece them together to create a new idea. And he says, I'm going to write letters to the United States. on apartheid and anti-apartheid. So every week he writes letters and he sends them to the United States. A few years later, the United States starts answering. And then he says, wow, who's going to lead this nation? Who's going to lead this nation? Who's going to lead this nation? And then all of a sudden he started thinking, maybe I could lead this nation. Maybe I'm the guy that should lead this nation. And as he starts to ask this question, the most important question comes out. How would I have to be to lead a nation? Now this is greatness. And he transmuted his hatred into kindness. He took his judgment and turned it into compassion. He took his bitterness and turned it into unlimited mind. He walks out of that prison 27 years later. He gets to lead a nation. And so we are defined by our adversity. We are literally defined by our adversity. And if you can't take a past experience and transmute that emotion into wisdom, then you will never evolve in one lifetime. So there are people in the world that have it harder than us, that confront adversity every single day. And if you can't see that your frustration is still keeping you to the past, then you will only create more of the past. When you realize that that frustration can be transmuted into something else, and that you tell the story of your own transformation one day, now you're liberated, and everybody can do that in this world.
Tenemos una pregunta muy práctica de Marlene. Marlene tiene un hijo con necesidades especiales, está lleno de ansiedad, está lleno de enfado, y pregunta cómo puedo ayudarle a darle la vuelta a esa condición, a esa situación. Marlene is having a special needs kid that is full of anger and anxiety and feeling bad, and she's asking, how can I help him to transform it, to make a change?
Well, information is power. Information about yourself is self-empowerment. So with children that struggle with special needs, if it was my child, the number one thing I would do is I would get a functional brain scan, a functional SPECT scan. Now, why? Because you never know unless you look. You never know unless you look. And I was talking to some people earlier today. 25 years ago, you had a problem with the brain, you took a CAT scan of the brain. It was a snapshot. You look for broken parts or missing pieces or damaged areas. The technology today with a functional scan allows you to see a brain in action, a brain at work, a motion picture of the brain. And when you see a motion picture of the brain, that's called mind. Mind is the brain in action. So when you begin to see a child and you see how their brain is working, you can see whether it's an attention problem. You can see what circuits are working too hard and what circuits aren't working enough. And the research in the United States now shows, because there's 3 types of stress, physical, chemical, and emotional, there's 3 ways to create balance in the body, physically, chemically, and emotionally. So you start beginning to do things that help to heal that brain based on whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's vitamins and nutraceuticals, they show very strong changes, whether it's aerobic exercise, whether it's eating certain foods and eliminating other foods, whether it's teaching them certain coping skills or certain modeling procedures. Once you understand the pattern, now you know how to get from here to here. And so there's unlimited amount of research now showing that the process of helping a special needs child is based on those 3 things, and that the process, if the child is young enough, in understanding how the brain develops, can allow the child to move very naturally and very quickly through those stages. And in a loving, nurturing, patient environment, children do much better than in a toxic, angry, stressed out environment. So if you go to our website and you send the question in, we'll hook you up with physicians that could help you with that.
Okay, great. Tenemos una pregunta de Magali que pregunta una cosa que seguramente muchos nos preguntamos muchas veces, es ¿cómo puedo diferenciar mis pensamientos para saber si están viniendo desde mi ego o están viniendo desde la claridad de mi transformación? She's asking a question that probably a lot of people is asking every day. How can I know if the thoughts I'm having are coming from my ego or are coming from my soul?
This is a good question.
Yeah.
Anything different is good. So, most people never sit long enough and quiet enough to get beyond themselves. So, we talk a lot about this in the workshops that we do. Most people, they get up in the morning, they get out of bed, they brush their teeth, they take a shower, they use the toilet, they look in the mirror, they get dressed, they drink coffee out of their favorite mug, they drive to work the same way, they see the same people, they do the same things. For the most part, they're on a program, an automatic program. And that program is the same program as the day before. So if you keep doing it over and over again, your future is more of your past. And so the body, you wake up in the morning and it goes through a series of routinized behaviors and thoughts and emotions. And there's not a lot of room for the unknown to fit in there because the program's running. So we could say the body's in the future based on the past. So the body's never in the present moment. When you truly get to that point where you're in the present moment, you become very in tune with your soul. You become very in tune with intuition. You become very in tune with a sense of self that isn't driven by the emotions that keep us regulating an identity or a personality. So I always say anything different is good. And if you're getting the same thought every day, like, I need to leave this relationship, or I need to move to this city, or I need to change my job, that can be an intuitive thought. It could also be a speculative thought. But for me personally, I like to ask for feedback in my life. In other words, I always say at the end of my meditation, okay, well, if my future is that, then I need a sign to let me know that that's the direction I need to go. If my future is this, then if I'm creating opportunity, then I need feedback in my life to let me know that I should head in that direction. So I pay attention to the signs, not just to the thoughts, but then how it begins to unfold in my life. And if it starts to move in this direction, I trust in that direction. If my life begins to move in this direction, I trust in that direction. But most people, they spend very little time in the present moment, and that's a skill. And when you're in the present moment, you're clear. When you're in the present moment, your body's no longer in the future, or your body's no longer in the past, and you see things much more clearly. You're in tune with your thoughts, and there's less analysis, there's less confusion, there's less criticizing. There's a thought that makes complete sense to you, and that thought that is very sensible and very clear is not based on the past or the future. It comes from the present. So teaching people how to do that is one of the things that we do in our workshops.
Tenemos una audiencia de mucho nivel hoy. Antonio hace una pregunta muy interesante. Pregunta, ¿cómo puedo ser capaz de innovar si he crecido en un sistema educativo en el cual yo no he sido enseñado, no he sido entrenado, a veces incluso empujado hacia abajo, hacia la innovación? Y ahora no tengo esta energía dentro de mí para crear la innovación. ¿Dónde puedo encontrar esta energía? We have a great audience today, and Antonio is making a question very well connected to the educational system we have in Spain. He's asking, how can I innovate when I wasn't taught to innovate when I was in the educational system, and I don't have that energy now inside. I want to have that energy. Where can I find it?
Well, this is a very good question. The indoctrination into the educational model is a very self-limiting indoctrination. And people's self-worth and their self-esteem are based on regurgitating answers to questions that are based on theories that may or may not be true. And if you answer those questions correctly, you get a pat on the back and you're the head of your class. But if you're a free thinker and you don't necessarily ascribe to those ideas, or you're thinking in different ways, you get an F, which means you failed. And so your self-esteem is caught up in failure, and that begins to brand you that you're not worth it, or you're not smart or secure in your own knowledge base. And the educational system is a flawed system in a lot of ways, and now's not the time to talk about it. But to answer the question is that we have to become curious again. We have to begin, look, how available is information? 25 years ago, you were diagnosed with a health condition. The doctor told you needed a surgery. You went and you did the surgery. There was just no question involved. Fast forward to today, the doctor says you have this condition. Everybody kind of listens and they say these are the procedures. Everybody goes home and gets on the internet. And they have medical access. And they can spend 3 hours on the internet and learn a lot of information about their own condition. And then they can choose what they want to do. That's really empowering. But my question is, do you want to wait for that point to be given a diagnosis, or do you want to just be a child again and begin to ask really important questions, really fundamentally important questions based on curiosity, speculation, idealism, and then set up a structure where you study with it and have a book club or a study group, and every week somebody presents something new. You present this week, you present next week, you present the following week, and we discuss these ideas. A very Socratic, very healthy way of interacting. And as you begin to contemplate concepts that you learn, the contemplation process is the building process neurologically in the brain. And you begin to install new circuits that causes you to perceive your life differently. So the indoctrination of an educational system that's based on right and wrong answers is very self-limiting. But we know that the brain is completely plastic, which means then if you're not learning, if you're not growing, if you're not asking bigger questions, then you're allowing yourself to be defined by your past. I would say to that person, get out there and learn. Get out there and create a structure to learn. Get around people that want to learn. Study documentaries. See YouTube videos of people talking. Get involved. Become inspired by learning again. Learning should be a reward in and of itself. And if we stop learning and we keep feeling, now we're headed for our genetic destiny.
Mm-hmm. It's 9:05. I have one last question.
Yes, okay. I hope I can answer it.
I take the opportunity to be here, and then I grab it, and I have one question. How is the Joe Dispenza you are dreaming, you are working on creating, the future Joe Dispenza you imagine?
Well, we need a bottle of wine. I think the greatest true passion for individuals, the greatest and the highest form of motivation is purpose motivation, duty motivation, a service to contribute to the world. I'm the happiest when I'm learning, when I'm changing, and when I'm contributing. That's what I know.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly believe that the way to transform a culture is to transform individuals. And so the Joe Dispenza that's sitting here today is certainly not the Joe Dispenza from 5 years ago or 2 years ago. But I'm in a position where I just can't do this all by myself. You know, I mean, we have invitations all over the world. And so we are creating a model of change that's reproducible. Whether we're doing it in a corporation, whether we're doing it with parents and children, whether we're doing with coaching people, we're creating models of transformation and then training people how to do it. Because I don't want it to be about me, I want it to be about the service to others. So we have a very strong base of trainers now that we're training, and that is very rewarding because I believe that when you're in power, give it away. That's my model. If I'm doing well, if I want to continue to create, then once I know how to do this, I'm going to pass it off to you and I'm going to create something else. So we have a good model that we are initiating in companies and organizations around the world. We have psychotherapists on our team that are helping develop a model of transformation in the psychotherapeutic, neuropsychotherapeutic model. I am in the midst of writing another book again. I can't believe I'm doing that, but I'm writing another book to empower people about this concept of mind over matter. And I certainly see that transformation is becoming measurable. And I'll say this. After What the Bleep and after I wrote my first book, everybody's got the information and they said, wow, this is really good information, but how do we do it? How do we do this? So then we started teaching workshops around the world. And because we studied spontaneous remissions, I said, well, now that we know the common things, we should be able to reproduce those and produce physical changes in people's bodies. Well, when we were teaching the workshops, something amazing happened. About 2 years ago, we started seeing people with MS and lupus and cancer and Hashimoto's syndrome and celiac disease right during our workshops get better, like go into remission. So now I knew at that point that something transformational was happening right in our workshops. We're making history here. And so this was right around the time that I wrote the second book, Breaking the Habit, and we created the book and course for the corporations and companies. We were doing that at the same time. But all of a sudden now, we're producing results. Now, when something happens once, that's called an incident. When it happens twice, it's called a coincidence. When it starts happening many, many times, we're looking at a trend here. So now we're seeing this amazing trend. People send emails all the time. My health condition is in remission, whatever. So this is where we're going now. In our last advanced event in the United States, I brought on a team of neuroscientists and quantum physicists, and we began to measure our participants' brains before and after the event. During the event, we were hooking up people randomly to electroencephalograms. We were measuring the field, the energy in the room, and correlating changes in brain states with fluctuations in the quantum field. And the neuroscientist that was heading the experiment sent me an email on my way to Europe, and he said, sit down when you read this. And he said, 93% of the people that we did a brain scan on during the retreat that you had a more than 80% change for the better in their brain. Now that is clinically and statistically very significant. So this is basically people having a very transformative experience. So the concept of information to transformation allows us, when we measure transformation, that's more information. Mm-hmm. So now that information serves to teach transformation better. And then if we can measure that transformation again, we can teach it even better to measure it again, and so the cycle continues. More information allows us to teach transformation better. If we can measure transformation, that's more information. So where Joe Dispenza hopefully will be in the future is closing the gap between that. And so we're measuring real-time brain changes. I was on the phone with a scientist just before I got into this room that I want to measure more somatic markers, things like, epigenetic changes during meditation. I mean, it's an expensive thing to do, but I want to do it. And so we're quantifiably measuring transformation right now, and we're doing it with common people. They're not Buddhist monks, they're not priests, they're not nuns, they're common people. And in 4 days, we were able to produce significant changes in their brain. We measured the field around their body. We measured the energy centers in their body. We measured fluctuations in the quantum field. And we know that subjective mind, your brain and your mind, produces effects in the objective world. And so closing that gap is my passion. And when people begin to realize that we can continue to close that gap, it's like the 4-minute mile. Once the 4-minute mile is run, and you do it, and I do it, everybody else is going to start to do it. And when you begin to imprint that in the morphogenic field, it gets easier and easier for people to access. You give a group of people a crossword puzzle that are experts in crossword puzzles, and you time them, and it takes 2 hours for them to do the crossword puzzle. But then, unbeknownst to another group of people, you give them the same crossword puzzle a day later. The people who do the crossword puzzle a day later do it in half the time than the people who did it the first day, because the information is in the field, so they can access it. So as you begin to transform your health condition into something else, you imprint that into the morphogenic field. Other people begin to access that, and they're no longer relying on the medical model any longer. They're beginning to understand they can regulate their states. So that's our future. We're doing it, we're measuring it. We know that what meditation does to the brain and body now. We know what it does to the field. We know what it does to the field around people's bodies. We've measured significant changes in 200 people in an event in Phoenix. And that information we'll publish and hopefully help people to demystify transformation a little more.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bueno, no ha habido mejor manera de comenzar este ciclo de conferencias de Barcelona Inspira Conciencia. Os esperamos el próximo miércoles a las 7:30, 19:30, hora española. De nuevo tendremos a Josep María Miró con la siguiente conferencia de la serie. Muchas gracias al doctor Dispenza por una ocasión magnífica y por revelarnos un montón de cosas, por responder a las preguntas, y estará de vuelta en mayo, el 30 de mayo, con nosotros, y habrá una nueva ocasión de aprender, de debatir y de todos juntos pues co-crear esa nueva realidad que todos deseamos que llegue. Gracias por estar ahí.
Gracias.